Hi, it's Pastor Jeff Elliott from Cape May Lutheran Church with our sermon for this week. This will be the week of November 15th, 2020. We are still in Matthew's Gospel, at the end of Matthew's Gospel. For the church year A, we deal with Matthew's Gospel in the Common Lectionary, and we're nearing the end of the church year. Next week is Christ the King Sunday, and that will be the final teaching of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew when he teaches the parable of the sheep and the goats. But today we are covering the second in that series of parables, the 10 bridesmaids, the talents, and the sheep and the goats. And today our sermon is entitled The Talents. We must teach ourselves to trust God. It is the one thing that is necessary. We must teach ourselves to trust, to surrender ourselves, to fall into God's hands, to let ourselves die, trusting that we will be reborn. We must teach ourselves to wait faithfully on God. We must teach ourselves to endure the long, slow passage through death to life, just as Jesus did. There is no use trying to attempt substituting something for this, some worldly scheme. We must surrender to life through death. No amount of fretting, no amount of prudence will save what Luther calls the old Adam. We could say the old Eve as well, but the old sinner that's within us. Our false self has to die and rise again. Jesus has to be born within us and rise again, the Christ, God within, whatever you wish to call it. They're all metaphoric language, remember. But the important thing to remember is this: the judgment is already over. God has already come, if we have eyes that can see it. I begin this way because these three sermons, as we said last week, are about the God who is missing, or the God who is hidden, what Luther called in Latin the Deus absconditus. We won't go into that again. But we will talk about this king who returned to the king's people at the end of Matthew, insisting that when Jesus originally told these parables, in what we call the Q source often, the common source shared by Luke and Matthew, those writers, is the best way, that the common series of parables that Jesus taught. When Jesus originally taught these parables, they did not refer to his second coming at some time in the future. That's not just my opinion. That's the opinion of the Bishop of Durham, the conservative evangelical scholar, Tom Wright, or N.T. Wright, as he's more formally known. And I think he's absolutely correct about that. The people who heard Jesus would not have had any context to understand this as the second coming of Jesus. They didn't know that Jesus was going to be crucified. They didn't know that Easter was coming. So when Jesus tells these stories, he's talking about not some coming in the future, but about his trip to Jerusalem. This is just before the Passion story begins in Matthew's Gospel, just before Palm Sunday, just before what we call Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And so it's that trip that Jesus is talking about. Jesus is inviting those who have ears to hear to know that when the prophets talk about the return of God to Zion, right, when they hold that picture in their heads from Amos onward, the coming day of the Lord, when people picture that, they should picture that as they watch this young prophet enter Jerusalem mounted on a donkey as the Prince of Peace. The people were hoping to see God return, and the return of God was always thought of as violent and judgmental. The people were hoping to see God come and send the Romans packing. They wanted to see God restore the temple and take it away from what it had become under the high priest Annas and Joseph Caiaphas, kind of a money-making scheme, the pseudo-king Herod and his family. But anyway, the thing to remember is that at that moment when Jesus told these stories, just before he enters Jerusalem, he's trying to help people to see that he embodies the God who will return, that his stories illuminate. We're talking about the coming of Jesus as God to Zion. Now, the parable of the talents looks at the servants who were given various amounts of money here in Matthew. It's the same amount that they're given in Luke. They're all given the same amount. It's probably the original, frankly. But here in Matthew's gospel, they're given different amounts for whatever reason would have fit the church in Matthew's day. The church has already started to evolve by then. There is such a thing as a church. There was no church in Jesus' day when he told these stories. But the church has begun to evolve by 80-something when Matthew's writing this gospel. So it's 55 years or so after the crucifixion and resurrection. And we're looking at the stewardship that each servant is given over part of the master's property. And each servant gains a certain amount. But remember, the amount that they gain varies, but each gains depending upon the amount that the servant has been given. The one who is given the most gains the most, but always the amount that is gained is based on the blessing that's been given. We're not to see that it depends on the effort or the skill of the investor, right? It's not like the one given 2 talents suddenly returns 10. The one given 5, returns 6 or whatever. The one who is given the most returns the most to the master. The one who's given less returns less. So this is not about skillful investing or skillful stewardship over money. That's really not what Jesus is striving at. And also, the one who does not invest the money, the one who instead of making the money, putting the money to work, buries it in the yard and returns it to the master in full. This is not a critique of that person's ability to handle money. That's not what this is about. He's not cast out in the end because he's guilty of doing anything evil. Think about it. He doesn't take his master's money. He doesn't steal it. He returns everything the master gave to him in full. The thing that this parable examines is the attitude that each of the servants has toward the master. The first 2 trust the master, and so they put to work the master's property that they've been given stewardship over. The third servant, the one who buries it in the ground, does not trust the master. He has a different attitude toward the master. And to think that the prize of his favorable judgment is this inability to trust in the master's kindness. He says that our translation says a harsh man. A hard man is probably a better strict translation of the Greek here, but the master is a hard man in his opinion, and he fears the master. He fears the judgment that is to come. And so because he views him as a hard man, he buries the talent in the backyard so he can give it to him upon his return. Jesus' point is that God is not a hard God who wishes to punish us for wrongdoing. Jesus' point is that God is mighty to save. Right now, God is present with us, calling us to faithful action now. God is present in the gifts that God has given. God is present as the blessings that God has given. And so we put them to work, confident of God's loving care, confident of a God who has already judged us as forgiven. The only thing we can do to block that process is not to trust in the goodness of God, not to trust in the mercy of God, not to trust that God is kind, to view him as hard or harsh. We just need to trust in God's forgiveness. And trusting in that forgiveness, we then pass on the blessing, not in order to save ourselves. Salvation's already occurred. We pass on the blessings because we've been blessed so that we can be a blessing. We have been loved, and knowing ourselves to be loved, we love others. But salvation is something that occurs as soon as the trust is present. We just need to say, yes, God, thank you for the blessing, and the forgiveness is already ours. Amen.